John Locke is the philosopher most directly associated with the ideological origins of the American Revolution, the thinker that Jefferson famously paraphrased with the Declaration of Independence and its assertion of the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Locke was an empirical philosopher who wrote on ethics, education, the philosophy of mind, and economics. His political theories are central to the social contract tradition that began with Hobbes. Locke uses many of Hobbes' key terms and concepts, but his use of these terms are informed by different assumptions and concerns, which take Locke's arguments in a different direction from those of Hobbes. Yet both men's theories were grounded in their direct experience with upheavals in English political life. Locke came of age during the revolutionary civil wars of the 1640s that inspired Hobbes' Leviathan, but he spent most of his working life in association with the Duke of Shaftesbury, who led the liberal tendency in Parliament under the Restoration regime of the Stuarts and the Kings Charles II and James II. In his capacity as a government secretary, Locke helped set up the government's first financial ministry. He also helped write the first charter for the Carolina colony, including its slave code. His two treatises on government were prompted by his experience in the Revolution of 1688. Unlike the chaotic and fanatic violence of the earlier civil wars, the 1688 revolution was carried off quickly and thoroughly, earning the historical designation of the Glorious Revolution. Prior to 1688, King James II had shown worrying signs of a tendency toward absolutist government and Catholic religion, both of which were unacceptable to the Protestant capitalist elites who dominated Parliament. In a deadlock with Parliament, James attempted to disperse the body and rule directly, a move which prompted a widespread revolt against his rule. Moving swiftly, parliamentary leaders invited James' Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William to rule Britain. The revolution was sealed with a passage of a Bill of Rights that for the first time explicitly limited the powers of the government and established the supremacy of Parliament's authority over that of the monarchy. So Locke's theories attempted to provide not just an abstract grounding for the necessity of government as such, but a concrete justification for the revolutionary overthrow of one government and the foundation of another. With Locke, we reach the origin of liberalism as a coherent body of thought. Paired with capitalist economics, liberalism would become one of the decisive ideological forces that shaped modernity. Nowhere is this more true than in the United States, where liberalism was present at the creation of the country. It was not a novel and insurgent tendency as it was in Europe, where liberals struggled against feudal and absolutist states. Lockean liberalism was something like the default ideology among the country's elite at the time of the Revolution, though it was one among many sources of the American independence movement. Americans who have never heard Locke's name or read a word of his philosophy are nevertheless steeped in Lockean ideas simply by virtue of living in the United States. Many of our default attitudes about property, popular sovereignty, and the rule of law are shaped by Locke's particular interpretation. The second treatise defends four key propositions. 1. That sovereign power resides in the people as a whole, who authorize the government to act on their behalf. 2. Government's power is limited by the nature of the contract that creates it. 3. The government's major task is regulating property and property relations. 4. Under certain conditions, the people are empowered to dissolve an incompetent or tyrannical government and create another one. Here we'll focus on the concepts that underlie Locke's theory of political power. For Locke, political power is one of many different power relationships, and each of these relationships has its own particular dynamic. There are power dynamics that shape all of our relationships, be they between parent and child, husband and wife, captain and crew, or master and slave. The particular concern of political power is creating and enforcing public laws, punishing their violation up to the point of death. Unlike Hobbes's notion of political power, this one is expressly limited. Political power is only legitimate if it respects the boundaries set up by the people. Within its sphere, the laws that regulate property and define punishment for offenses against it is all powerful. But it is just one form of power that operates in society. Today, we are far less likely than Locke is to isolate political power in this way and detach it from other kinds of power relationships. But Locke's focus has the advantage of concentrating our attention on the unspoken motivating assumptions that guided the development of political liberalism. For Locke, the state of nature is not the pitiless death struggle that Hobbes conjures up. Fear and violence are not at the root of Locke's concept of human nature, and so as he sees it, it is possible for societies to organize themselves in the state of nature and make some kinds of progress. Locke's state of nature possesses inherent laws and necessities, like Hobbes's did. Humans are absolutely free to dispose of themselves and their belongings as they see fit. Moreover, Locke says that humans recognize this freedom in others. While many will violate others' natural freedom without hesitation, others will not do so. That is, if I am under attack by my neighbor in the state of nature, I have a right to defend myself by any means necessary. What Locke says is that, humans being what they are, we can expect others, sometimes, to assist us in our defense. We might even be the type of person who helps others defend their rights, knowing that each time this is done, it reinforces the natural law of personal freedom. The major problem with the state of nature, as Locke sees it, is confusion. Say I'm taking a walk one day and come upon two people fighting over possession of a piece of land. Each claims the property is theirs and is being violated by the other person. What do I do in this situation? How am I to judge who has the best right to this property? Who should I assist and why? Remember, this comes down to a question of violence. Locke's assumption is that I am deciding on whose behalf to use force. The problem is that I cannot know who is right and who is wrong in this situation. If property belongs to whoever can hold it, then there is no prospect for the long-term stability or growth of society. Conflict and violence are always on the verge of breaking out. This is the case because, for Locke, people will go to any lengths to defend their property. As Locke sees it, property is the most important thing in the world. We should never forget that John Locke was a well-to-do Englishman of the 17th century, meaning that while he believed his ideas were universally valid, they are entirely stamped with the social conditions and assumptions of Locke's own circumstances, hence his absolute insistence on the value of property. Locke took for granted the idea that a person becomes a politically relevant actor once he has claimed and improved some piece of property. These actions give him a tangible stake in society and thus a share in the responsibility of governing. The idea that only people with a property-based stake in society should have political power remains with us today, and it remains an assumption with broad credibility among American conservatives. This is in part due to the fact that American champions of Locke, like Thomas Jefferson, believed that the vast lands available in North America would make property ownership a reality for the vast majority, who could rule themselves in a democratic republic of property owners. But of course, that's not how history developed, and the rise of the capitalist wage system created a huge class of workers who owned nothing and depended on their paychecks to survive. But for Locke, living prior to the advent of industrial capitalism, it seemed natural that the relevant political community would be the independent property owners. This is because property was not just a collection of things or a piece of land. For Locke, property was something more than that. It had metaphysical qualities that transformed the people who controlled it. One feature of Locke's modernity is a certain contempt for nature. Ancient and medieval thinkers understood the earth as a divine creation that reflected God's will. Nature was infused with spirit and was treated as such. The pioneers of scientific modernity rejected this view, and looked on nature as so much stuff, just raw material to be shaped by human action. Locke's state of nature is a kind of huge natural resource, with no inherent value until granted value by human activity. The activity that creates value is human labor. Like Marx, Locke emphasized the unique creativity of human labor, because human labor translates images and impulses that exist only in the mind and makes them real. Thus, for Locke, when we change some piece of nature by working on it, by shaping it according to a mental design, we basically infuse part of ourselves into nature. Say I'm walking through the wilderness and get hungry. and I come across an apple tree. One option is for me to eat some apples and go on my way. This is the state of nature, and all of its bounty belongs equally to everyone. But I could also collect some seeds, clear some land, and plant my own apple orchard. I can grow what I want and how I want it, and so long as I can defend this land that I've made my own, I have property. That is, labor has translated my thoughts into reality. This little patch of the world has taken on a new shape and a new purpose because of me. I have mixed a bit of myself into the natural world, and in doing so, I've created property. We have to assume that all sorts of people, everywhere in nature, make property in this way. Some can defend it, some cannot. But so long as the state of nature endures, there is no universally recognized register of property, and no reliable code of law that restricts violations of property. Confusion reigns, and the way out is for property owners to make a covenant, a contract among themselves in which all participants give up their right to enforce the natural law and hand that right over to a government. This government is empowered to recognize, regulate, and defend property, and so create the conditions of predictability and stability that make civilization possible. But where Hobbes said that this Leviathan was unlimited in power, Locke's government is inherently limited. Its realm of authority is the political disposition of property and nothing else. Locke's major contributions to liberalism are his theories of property and limited government, but he was a product of his time and no hardcore libertarian. We need to be clear on how Locke is using language here. He's happy to toss around collective nouns like the people and concepts like popular sovereignty, but who are the people? What does their sovereignty look like? For Locke, the people refers to the political community, those people with the power to act. But that does not mean everyone in society. Locke was no leveler or no digger. Much like the "we the people" of the Constitution's preamble, Locke has in mind a fairly small class of independent property owners whose freedom is defined by their self-reliance. Anyone considered a dependent, and this included women, landless men, servants, and slaves, was a member of society, but not a member of the political community that made and enforced society's rules. This points to a core contradiction in the liberal ethic that has long dominated American political life. This liberalism creates a charmed circle of freedom and equality for a small community of citizens whose own status depends on their control of land and labor. Within the community, talk of liberty makes sense, but it is not applicable to the dependents outside that community. Thus, the Southern slave regimes up to the Civil War insisted that Southern states were good Lockean republics in which the rights of the political community were preserved. The coerced slave labor that sustained that society, though, was outside this boundary of protection and had no political rights that had to be taken seriously. This ideological heritage persists and is as much Locke's legacy in the United States as his rhetoric of popular sovereignty. Next time, we'll see how these views affected Locke's theories regarding when a revolution against an illegitimate government could be mounted.